Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Matravers. I'm a professor of law at York Law School. And first of all, let me just say welcome. It's great that you can join us. It would have been nice, of course, to have the audience join us in person in York, but we'll do our best over Zoom. So this is a session on the future of prisons, and it's part of the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council Festival of Social Science, to celebrate the ways in which social science can help us understand the world and address the problems in the world. And the problems we're going to be addressing are problems around imprisonment and prisons. I'm immensely pleased and honored to be joined by our guests this evening. Alison Liebling is Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Cambridge and Director of the Institute of Criminology's Prisons Research Centre. She's carried out a significant program of research on measuring the moral quality of prison life, the effectiveness of suicide prevention strategies in prisons, and values, practices, and outcomes in public and private sector corrections. Scott Hechinger is a public defender in New York and founder of Zealous, zelo.us, which activates, trains, and supports public defenders in partnership with local organizations and the people and communities they serve to move their advocacy outside of court. His goal is to end mass criminalization and to promote public health in its place. Irwin James has been a columnist and contributor to The Guardian since 1998. He is the editor-in-chief of Inside Time, the national newspaper for prisoners and detainees. He's the author of Redeemable, a memoir of darkness and hope, which tells of his troubled childhood, the crimes he committed, and the 20 years he spent in prison before his release, and, as it says there, redemption. So thank you very much to all of you. So the way this is going to work is that we will be doing it in a conversational style, and given that this is Zoom, it'll have the advantages and disadvantages of that. And there isn't a script. We're just going to be addressing questions, but to give you an idea of where this is going, the general idea is to talk first about the ways in which prisons work and don't work at the moment, then about what might be done to reform them, and then about what the challenges are to that reform. So I'm just going to pause for a second because I can't see anyone on my screen. So I'm hoping if everyone can now unmute and put their videos on, then we can start. Great. So I think it's not controversial or even political now to say that prisons are in deep trouble. We know that rates of recidivism, that is reoffending after people get out of prison, are very high. We know that within prisons, there's a great deal of self-harm. There's a great deal of harm to officers. Suicide rates are up. Rehabilitation is down. So there are lots and lots of problems currently with the prison system. And it's also very, very expensive. Even David Cameron, one of the very few prime ministers in the UK to talk about prisons in a major speech, was concerned that the prison system and its inability to reform people and reduce recidivism was costing around, his estimate was 13 billion a year. So there's a lot that we need to address, and that's before we think about Scott, who from the United States, where the prison system is characterized by what's often known as mass incarceration and has problems beyond the ones here, which overlap with racial issues in the United States. So I wanted to begin by just asking the panelists to give a sort of very brief indication of their sort of current diagnosis of how prisons and imprisonment are doing. And I was going to turn first to you, Alison.
Thank you, and very nice to be here, Matt, although obviously the topic that we're discussing is a tough one, and it's perhaps a particularly painful time to be talking about prisons for all the obvious reasons that COVID has in many ways exposed the prison, I think, for what it is. But even without COVID, I was thinking about what would be my current diagnosis. And you just said something about prisons being expensive. And actually, top of my list is that prisons are too cheap, and that is one of our problems, that we've actually had quite a systematic attempt to make prisons cheaper so that we can afford more of it. And I think prisons should be more expensive, that the consequences of cheapening prison is that we've had to kind of reorganize prison labor, which means we've cheapened the price of a prison officer. That's led to all sorts of negative consequences, high turnover, lack of experience, lots of experienced, expensive staff leaving, and so on. So I think we should interrogate this notion of prisons being expensive. We could have made a very different choice. So we could have addressed the other top of my list problem, which is the length and complexity of sentences, that we have really lengthened sentences so that almost half our prison population, I think, is serving 10 years or more. We have more life sentence prisoners than the rest of Western Europe put together, etc. So we could have decided to spend less money, but spend it by keeping sentences under control. So I think we've created a prison population who are kind of feeling a bit hopeless and forgotten, and also a bit victimized, which is a bit counterproductive. The prison system is kind of over politicized. It feels to me as if there's almost a kind of willed misunderstanding of how prisons function to make them serve political ends. Maybe that's linked to creeping over centralization. And there's a crisis of safety, which is linked to problems of legitimacy. I think the language is becoming rather sinister, that we're hearing words like parking long-term prisoners, segmenting the prison population, settling people at the beginning of their sentences. It's a very technocratic and slightly scary language. And then finally, well, I could go on forever, but another problem is the crisis of leaving, that whatever we're doing in prisons and with prisons, we are particularly bad at connecting entering prison to leaving prison. So many of the disqualifications of being in prison persist on release, and that's kind of unintended but devastating. So that's the top of my list for now.
Thank you very much. I should have said, yes, I think by expensive, I meant expensive as a matter of public policy, that there must be cheaper ways to achieve as not good outcomes, but we can return to that at the end. But perhaps I could turn to you, Scott. I mean, you could certainly pick up the last point Alison made there about the collateral effects of punishment, of things like disenfranchisement and not being able to get public housing. But how do you see the prison situation as it is now?
I know we only have an hour and a half, but maybe we could extend this to 4 to 5 hours and I can maybe get to the point. But look, when you're talking about the United States, you're talking about a lot of things when it comes to prison. You're talking about, American exceptionalism, truly. 2.3 million people incarcerated, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated population. The number of people we simply detain pre-trial, presumed innocent, is larger than everyone incarcerated in India, even post-conviction. We have over 4.5 million people on supervision. So even if they don't go to prison on the front end and serve probation sentences or are released early on parole, there are 4.5 million people that are still under state supervision and described feeling like they're in invisible cages. We spend $118 billion a year on mass incarceration. And when you look at those numbers and the size of the system, not to mention the disproportionate racial component, disproportionately Black and brown people who are in the system. When you measure that against the goals of punishment, kind of the historical goals, incapacitation, rehabilitation, punitiveness or punishment and deterrence, it fails spectacularly in every way. Incapacitation, 98% of people who are incarcerated get out at some point, roughly the size of Seattle, the cities of Seattle and Boston put together, but 600,000 people are released every year. Rehabilitation, we know that actually, you mentioned recidivism, the characteristics of, I only can speak to American prisons, the characteristics that characterize American prisons, shame, isolation, economic deprivation, and violence itself, are the primary drivers of violence When you talk about punishment, what we found actually is that people being pushed away, separated from the harm, even in the violent cases, which are actually a smart percentage, in the violent cases, pushing them away from the harm that they caused and putting them in cages and not having them confront the people who they actually harmed, doesn't actually serve an accountability from an accountability standpoint. And deterrence, we know from data that harsher sentences don't deter crime. So it really kind of every single measure, not only do we have an outbloated, costly, violent, brutal system that also takes away money from things that could actually provide public health and public safety, but the system actually undermines the things that it's supposedly set up to actually help solve. And so the future of prisons for me is a page one rewrite. Let's put it that way.
Okay, well, we'll turn to how to rewrite in just a second. But Owen, when you look at the prison system now and the the recent reports, for example, by the chief inspector, what do you see? How do you see the current state of prisons?
Well, what I do see is that I went to prison for life in 1984, and here I am, nearly 40 years later, and it's the conditions that we're keeping people in, notwithstanding the COVID crisis, which has really exacerbated the problematic situation for people in jail. I mean, it really has made it more difficult for the prisoners, for their families, for the staff. The COVID thing has really exacerbated a whole load of problems. But last year, we had far too many people in prison locked in their cells for 22 or 23 hours a day. I mean, I was locked in my cell in 1984 in Wandsworth for my first year in jail for 23 hours a day. And people thought, oh my goodness, how are you managing that? Well, you just manage it. But here we are. Up until pre-COVID, we had people, locked in their cells, not doing very much with their time other than watching daytime TV and not a whole lot of constructive stuff going on. So we've as Alison pointed out, we've lengthened sentences almost beyond measure. If you think in 1979, the average time that a life was spent in prison in custody was 9 years. 1979. Now it's about 22 years. What if you're a victim of somebody like I was? How long's long enough? How long? There is no length of a sentence that will ever appease people who've been really harmed by people like I was, by people in prison. It's a difficult, it's if you're a victim of crime, especially serious grief causing crime, it's very difficult to even think rationally about how we use our prison system. But I went to jail without any ideas of, I didn't understand the role of prison in society, other than I mustn't get caught or I'll go to prison. I didn't think I mustn't do a bad thing, I'll go to prison. When you're in that, the lifestyle that I had was about surviving and not doing very well at it. And then I went to prison, and I learned a language. I learned a social language that I never had before. I went in there ill-educated, inarticulate. I was lucky I met some amazing people who work in our prisons, who want and still do want people like I was to get out and have lives, that don't cause more harm and distress to people. And I made it. But I said to you earlier, Matt, I did it by chance, not by design. I was one of the lucky ones. Our system really does. Our system debilitates, infantilizes. Our prison system undermines all the things that when we talk about morality and values, our prison system undermines the best of us. Even if you go in there and you have good intentions, Christ, you've got to duck and dive and survive in those places.
Great, thank you. So sorry, I should now apologize. I should have said to the audience at the start of this, if you do want to ask questions, please pop them in the Q&A box which you'll find if you look at the bottom of your screens. And we probably won't. And I've got a research assistant, Kezia, who will feed through some questions at about halfway through, and we'll start to address them. We might not be able to address all the questions, so if we don't get to yours, I'm sorry, but do ask questions in that Q&A box. So just to return then, so before we get on to the question of how do we make prisons better, and what should they look like? You've all identified a problem, which is that there are too many people in prison. There are too many people in prison, and that's stretching whatever available resources there might be. Clearly, one way which you've sort of spoken about, all of you actually, is to reduce the length of sentences. But what else could we do as a society to reduce the number of people in prison? I mean, there have been suggestions. Andrew Ashworth, a very notable criminal lawyer at Oxford, has suggested not sending people to prison for property offences. So there are a number of suggestions out there, but I wonder what you think the way is to try to, in a sense, address one of the problems, which is just the number of people going in. Scott, I don't know whether you've got a... Again, you don't have 4 hours, but...
I know. I do want to start and just go off of something that Irwin was talking about, which is just kind of how, it was bad before, and COVID has just kind of underscored how bad it is. And I think that's a really important point for people to know, that at least in the United States, I can't speak for there, people seem more aware than ever before about how horrible the conditions are, and can feel it and understand it in some ways. Better than ever before during COVID, because we're all in this really strange, scary experience together. I can know for myself, like I feel concerned about, social distancing and having to wear a mask and, keeping my distance. But I have the choice. And so to imagine, and for me, it's easier to imagine because I work with thousands of people who have been in jail and prison. But for people who have never thought about it before, to them imagine inability to social distance, people in the United States throughout the country being prevented from having soap and hand sanitizer, in a lot of places actually being forced to mass produce it for people on the outside, but not being allowed to use it because it is alcohol and it's considered contraband. The fact that there's no masks, that people with symptoms are being held with people without them, and that when you ask for medical treatment, not only are you denied, but when you're given it, you're put in horrible conditions that, frankly, across the country, we're hearing, feces and mucus and blood on the walls that they have to clean themselves. What I will say is, it was bad before, and we've known it's long been bad. And it's not that it's gotten worse. It just, COVID has underscored and made more transparent and more understandable the issues that are kind of endemic to the system to begin with. And I think I'll just say really briefly that provides opportunity for narrative shifting more broadly. In terms of what we can do to reduce the populations, I think we should be talking about we should be talking really, and I look forward to this, about a world without prisons to begin with. I think it's very easy in my mind to talk about the low-hanging fruit: property offenses, drugs, crimes of poverty, non-violence. These are social and societal ills and health problems driven by mental health, substance use, violence itself, wanting to survive, that could be better suited with reinvestment in communities, or investment in the first place in communities, affordable housing, education, health, et cetera. That's the easy stuff. The harder conversations, I mean, it's still tough to have conversations about taking those out of prisons, but I think the tougher conversations that we need to be having, and I look forward to here, is about even when people are charged with violent offenses, right? That inflict true harm, and that there is trauma, and survivors of crime are looking for that healing. What do you do in those circumstances? And I'll say that it's clear to me, knowing what I know and having seen what I've seen, that prison not only doesn't prevent crime and solve it on the back end, it also doesn't heal the trauma of survivors. So I think an easy answer, if you want to cut a range of people out, is decriminalize a whole range of actions that are the product of public health problems that can be better solved by investing in community. That, I think, if you look at the data, that should be, easy enough if people are willing to kind of ignore the fear mongering and the interest groups, which is a harder battle.
Alison, I don't know whether you want to come in on this.
Well, I agree with all of that, but I would keep sentence inflation on the agenda, because it's not insignificant. It's the lengthening of sentences that's led to the accumulation of increasing numbers in prison. And I think even I've tested this with my checking in with members of the public used to happen in occasional taxi journeys. And I'm always amazed when, for example, especially journeys to prisons from stations to outposts, and people often don't have any idea just how long sentences have become. And so I've obviously got to know people serving very long sentences because they reappear in my research projects, and they're there trying to do education, some of them serving sentences of between 35 and 42 years. And these are men, often young when they get their sentences. They've got involved in something to do with drugs and guns. And when I encounter them, they are often in education departments worrying about their 12-year-old son who's starting to go the way they went, and feeling distressed and upset about how impossible it is to be a father from prison. And they can see exactly what's going on outside. So it feels like there's something that's made us inflate sentences in a way that I don't think the public are aware of. And what's the point of a 45-year tariff for somebody who's aged 20 when they commit a serious crime? So I think a bit linked to what Scott was saying earlier about alternatives, I think we should, the way we use prison is to sort of simplify really complex social problems. And we're so simplistic that we just sentence someone and then we kind of forget them for 25 years. We should be revisiting the evidence constantly. So I've been listening to the podcast by the Forgiveness Project, all about restorative justice, and some really moving examples of serious offenders who've eventually made contact in a very organized and sort of slow way with their victims' families. And it sometimes takes 2.5 years to even get them in the same room together. But that might happen 5 or 10 years into a sentence. And it's literally transforming for both the offender, who suddenly is ready to realize what they've done, and it's slightly more likely to heal the trauma for the victim than achieving something that feels a bit like revenge. So I think there's something about the way we use the prison to disappear problems and to disappear people, whereas actually people grow and develop, and we should be working with some of those natural processes. And it may be I'd be very interested to hear more from Irwin about stages that I can already see from the way you were talking about your experience, that it was the people who wanted to work with you and help you rather than the punitive experiences of imprisonment that sort of got in touch with the part of you that wanted to change and develop and grow. So I think there's something about how we see sentences, and that we're just too simplistic about the way we use long prison sentences in particular.
Okay, well, I mean, we could keep talking about this, and there's a lot to talk about. But since we have sort of moved on, it seems to be undeniable. Well, it is undeniable that prison sentences have got just much longer, and that's increased the prison population. And there's no, as you're saying, there's no sort of data to support that. But perhaps then we could move to the last point you made there, Alison, and I'll turn to you, Irwin, which is, for some people, clearly, prison perhaps is necessary. It perhaps can be redemptive. It perhaps is necessary for society for some people who are, at the time of imprisonment, dangerous and likely to commit serious offences. I'll come to Scott, who might contest some of that. But for the moment, if we assume we're not just putting people in prison and throwing away the key, but we're putting people in prison because of the need for protection, but also in order, in a sense, to help them insofar as that's possible, what does it need to look like? So what for you, just to pick up Alison's question, Owen, about stages, how do you think prison could play that role? And what would it need to look like in order to do so?
Matt, look, I'm not anti-prison. You know, I've debated with abolitionists. I believe that we need somewhere like prison to separate people who cause hurt, you know, grief and pain and to others. We need someone. We have to separate these people. Like I was, I needed separating. I was, you know, no question about it. I was a dangerous individual. But then, and you know, I've never been anti-prison. What I'm sort of anti is the fact that we have no no real understanding of what it is as a society we want from our prisons. You know, what is it we want from our prisons? Do we want to just separate people? Well, okay, but as Scott said, you know, 98%, in fact, probably more in this country, 99.9% of the people who go to prison, they will come out one day and they'll be somebody's neighbor. And my view is prison should be a place that encourages and motivates people to find the better versions of who they are, to be a better version of who they are, and to get out and live well. You know, that's my I'm not my own advocate here. You know, I was never sure I was going to get out alive, but I did, and thank God I developed some skills in jail that allowed me to live well after prison, and I gravitated towards people who, you know, some amazing people who work in those places, teachers and some good prison officers, some good governors who want their prisons. They want to have pride in what they do. But as a society, we don't really respect our prisons. I mean, you were talking about helping people in prison. That's the challenge for any civilized society. How do we help? If you're an individual, the challenge is to help somebody who's hurt us. Who wants to help people who hurt us? But if we don't help people when they're in jail to be the better versions of themselves, people will come out and hurt more people. You know, for me, it's all about that. I met every type of offender, every type of criminal I was in prison with. And the vast majority of the people I met hated being criminals, hated being harm causers, wanted to live a better way. But Christ, you've got to, you know, you can benefit from prison, but it takes a whole load of good luck to actually benefit from that, from the prison experience. And it shouldn't be like that. It should be by design. You know, prison should be a place we go in because we've hurt, we've caused pain, we've caused grief, we've stolen, whatever we've done. We go into jail, you know, hate the crime, hate the criminal, but give the prisoner a chance. That's what I would say. Because most prisoners, you give them a chance, most prisoners will take that chance and they'll repay you 100-fold. Give them a chance.
Thank you. So can I turn to you, Alison? Because I mean, this really is amongst your research projects. This is one that you've sort of pioneered. How to measure a good prison and what to do to make a prison better.
Yeah, I was thinking that while I was listening to Irwin, that what I'm interested in is the difference between prisons that are they're above the threshold, you know, and they produce better outcomes, and prisons that are terrible. And I think it's another thing that people maybe outside the prison system don't always understand, that prisons really differ. And actually, we know what good prisons look like. I've written an article about the last prison that made not just the team I was with to draw breath, but all the prisoners, you know, were saying, replicate this model. I've never been to a prison like this. This is a place of hope. And a lot of that is to do with size, freedom from restrictions emanating out of headquarters often. But it's also to do with who the staff are and their own understanding, their criminology. So I think there's something about culture, leadership, often history. Sometimes it's the layout. This particular prison that we were very impressed by, people just couldn't talk about it more positively. And the difference between that kind of prison and most of them is that prisoners described it as kind of individualized and person-centered, that staff were there to get alongside them, to do what Irwin described, to help prisoners find the better version of themselves. But there wasn't a kind of one-size-fits-all model of what that better vision was like. everyone was different and there was lots of flexibility. So even think like the governor actually broke some rules and kept a workshop instructor who was he worked with falcons, falconry and hawks, and prisoners were incubating and breeding these very difficult to breed young animals and then sort of releasing them back into the wild. And that had started when the prison had been a juvenile institution. And when it became adult, they were supposed to stop doing that. But the governor recognized that this was tapping into something that was really changing people's lives. And it was more interesting than crime, and it was very humanizing. And so she kept the workshop instructor on against the rules because she could see that this was giving her something that she wanted to make available to people. And that's just one example. But we know that better prisons are possible, and we know what they look like. So it's kind of frustrating that that information isn't being used more.
Alison,
Yeah, go on, Owen.
well, I was going to say, you know, I came across some really amazing initiatives during my prison time. I mean, I was in some real unpleasant places, but I also came across exactly what you're talking about, some good initiatives. But then if the press get a hold of it,
Yeah,
and they make a big deal about it, and then victims groups get,
yeah,
you know, they get angry because how, you know,
yeah.
I mean, there's a program on TV, I've taped it actually, the world's most luxurious prison. It's a prison in Norway. You've heard about it, Halden
Yeah,
Jail,
I have.
and that's the title. Instead of saying the world's most successful prison,
Yeah,
the title is the world's most luxurious prison. So straight away, people, you've got your back up. What
you know what?
luxurious prison? You know.
Owen, can I just stop you, because I want to come to the question of what stops us doing. You know, Alison says we know what a good prison looks like, so why don't we do it? Can we just come to that in a minute? But I'd just like to invite Scott just to say a few words, because I don't know nearly as much about the prison system in the US. I don't know whether there are, as it were, there must be better or worse, but whether there are any really good jails and prisons. And also, I suppose, Scott, I wanted to just press you a bit on whether the kind of prison Alison describes is one you have any space for, given what you said earlier about, you know, a sort of abolitionist view of let's imagine a world without them at all.
I think to save time for this portion of it, let's accept the world that we're currently living in, where a lot of people are in prison and the likelihood of abolition actually happening at least being a couple of years off. So at least right now, the features that she said, that she was talking about, are important. I have a couple others to add. I will say that there is not a single jail or prison in the United States that has that is good. I would say there's no jail or prison in the world that's good if we measure it based upon public health and public safety. But look, the people who I have met, and some of my colleagues who I work really closely with, who had access to education, bachelor's programs, master's programs, really amazing voluntary mentorship programs, leadership opportunities. They came out, even given the immense amount of obstacles coming out of prison. In the United States, 47,000 laws of restriction, where you can't get affordable housing, can't get benefits, can't get education, can't get employment. The list goes on, that further marginalizes people. Even given all that stuff, they still were able somehow to overcome and get jobs. But so voluntary programs, amazing. Alison mentioned, I mean, better than nothing, obviously. Alison mentioned the staff. The other piece is, with the staff, you need to have accountability. There's just like with police in the United States, the likelihood that a court officer or corrections officer is going to be held accountable when they do bad things, and they do them bad things all the time, matters in terms of kind of the health inside jails and prisons, the ability to ask for medical attention without fearing retribution. Jails and prisons in the United States have a serious crisis of accountability and transparency. And then there's just other conditions, like solitary confinement is rampant in the United States. Not just used as punishment, it's used for all kinds of reasons. And we know that it leads to serious consequences, including, you know, suicide, even once the person has been released. And so just operating within the world of prisons right now do exist. There are a range of ways to make them improve. And I'll just say, as a public defender, we had a public defender in Brooklyn. There was a big conversation about a year ago when we were trying to close Rikers Island, this famous penal colony in the middle of New York City that houses predominantly people presumed innocent, just awaiting their trial, and just a few people post-conviction serving short sentences. But it's notoriously violent and horrific, and we've been fighting for years to close it. There were folks on the other that were aligned with us that were also saying, okay, don't build new jails in its place. And it was this kind of binary between you get rid of this horrible jail and reduce jail populations, but build additional jails, or everything stays the same. And I got into the problem where I know, again, the reality right now is that jails are going to exist. And I have people who I represent, humans who are suffering on the inside without programs, without the ability to get outside themselves, with solitary, and families that are terrified for their loved ones. So in the meantime, I don't love the idea of not investing any amount of money in the places that cage human beings. I worry about putting too much money in, and it's a conflict, but I worry about putting too much money in because of the capacity of just further entrenching the status quo, which I've been pretty clear, I think is bad, for lack of a better term.
So thanks. I'm actually going to just pick up one of the questions that's appeared in the Q&A. I mean, we'll move on to sort of a formal Q&A in a bit, but one of the questions seems particularly relevant here, which is about what you think the best way of recruiting and training prison officers would be, because clearly prison officers play a huge role in a successful prison. And I simply don't know in the States. I mean, I know more about here, but I mean, if you had to envisage or if somebody were to ask you what would your ideal recruitment and training strategy be for prison officers, accountability I take for granted, all public institutions, the police. So I don't know what you'd respond to that. Yeah, Scott.
Again, assuming a world where they exist, I focused on people who are trained in social work and are treated and are trained in treatment and health approaches and rehabilitation. I take the example of parole and probation. Again, I don't know the systems over there necessarily. I should probably know them more. But at the turn of the century, when these alternatives to incarceration, so probation on the front end instead of a prison sentence, or parole, which is an early release, the people who were overseeing probationers or parolees were trained in social work. They weren't law enforcement professionals. And the goal was to make them better. When they messed up, when they smoked, when they did drugs, or they used alcohol, or they went and did something they weren't supposed to do, or even reoffended, they weren't immediately thrown back in jail. The person who was working with them actually stepped up services. And it found, it actually helped over time to reduce recidivism. Well, with the advent of mass incarceration, the kind of the politics of fear and media, and as billions of dollars started going into the system, at least in the United States, things changed with parole and probation too, and law enforcement officers took over. And the only solution to breaking of the rules on parole or probation became punishment. That's what you see in jail and prison right now. They are trained law enforcement professionals or law enforcement people who have one solution and are trained in one, generally trained in one kind of form of response, and that's force. That doesn't, that leads to violence, that leads to bad outcomes, that leads to less money over time and less investment in voluntary, in good programming in jails and prisons, and outcomes ultimately that are bad for not just the individual, but for society. So, yeah.
Thanks. So Owen or Alison, go on. What would...
Again, I could talk about this for 5 or 6 hours, but I'll try and say something very, very brief. I think it's a big question about prison officers, and there are some good schemes. There's a scheme at the moment called Unlocked, which is training graduates pretty comprehensively to try and slightly change the balance in prisons. But the point I wanted to make was there's a really good typology of prison officers. It arose from American work in prisons, but it's very recognizable here, dividing officers into 4 types. So avoiders, reciprocators, enforcers and professional. And what's complicated about good prison officers is they have to be what we call moral dualists. So there's a tendency to split criminal justice into the kind of good guys who are social work oriented and the bad guys who are law enforcement. But actually the best prison officers are this quite difficult and rare combination of understanding and interpreting behavior, but also setting limits, that they're very good at the use of authority, but in the old-fashioned social work way. So they understand about the importance of authority and boundaries, but they're interested in working with the person too. So I think there's a risk in assuming that the answer to law enforcement is social work that can sometimes start to edge towards reciprocity or collusion. And so I think this question about, we again, prisoners are really good at identifying who the best prison officers are in their prison. And it's never the reciprocators or the avoiders. It's the officers who are reliable, they respond, but they're not pushovers either. So I think there's lots of ways in which we could maximize what we already know about what makes a good prison officer. And the way not to do it is to try and force wages down to the very bottom that the market will bear.
Well,
You know, I've been so lucky. You know, I feel I'm blessed that by the grace of my society, I got a second chance. Not just a second chance, but I became a journalist. And unbelievable. You know, went to prison, completely a failed human being, came out 20 years later, a Guardian columnist. Unbelievable. But anyway, I made that. And in that capacity, I've been lucky enough to go to other countries and look at how they use prisons. And I go to Norway, and I know it's a bit of a cliche, all Scandinavians, they do it the best, you know, they're the best. But actually, they do it very well. I mean, I've visited Norwegian prisons. I've visited the Norwegians don't like criminals, and nobody else, you know, they don't like murderers and rapists and pedophiles and muggers, and they're not keen on criminals in Norway. But they have a system that lets people out of their prisons better than they were when they went in. You know, I visited a maximum security prison in a place called Skien, and this was a concrete and steel fortress, and there were people doing long sentences in there. But once I got through into the gates and I got into the pods where they lived, and I saw how the whole ethos, the whole facility was to enable the people in their care, the prison officers' care, to find the better part of themselves, to find a better way to live. And the officers there, that was the maximum security one, but I also went to Bastoy Prison Island, which is in the Gulf of Oslo. It's an island just 2 or 3 miles off the coast, and it's a complete prison island, and it's a very low security. You can you know, if you want to escape, you dive in and swim to the coast, you know. But what I found were happy prison officers, you know, smiling, happy, satisfied people who were doing something good for their society. I found people who, you know, who really they joined the service to do good. And the training was like it's a 3-year training course, whereas in the UK, our prison officers, I think they get 8 weeks, 10 weeks if they're lucky. And so, you know, I did meet some fantastic people in uniform in during my prison journey. But again, that was by chance. You know, you end up meeting people who look at what they're doing and they want to do good, and you get others who become indifferent, and you get others who become cynical. But the Scandinavian model for me, the Swedish prisons I've been to and the Norwegian prisons, it was a real professional career to be a prison officer, to go in to those places and help the people in their care to get out and live well. You know, that so to me that it was amazing to see I've never seen so many happy, smiling prison officers as I did when I went to Norway.
Yeah, I should say I had a slightly cross email this morning from someone saying, you know, why was a prison officer not on the panel, and I must admit I do regret not having a prison officer on the panel, and I think it is important to say, you know, that there are many fantastic prison officers, and at the moment, you know, the cuts in resources affect them too. I mean, you know,
Matt, you'd be amazed at how many letters we get in Inside Time from prisoners thanking the staff for what they're managing at the moment through the COVID thing, thanking and grateful for the staff. You know, they're doing an amazing job, but I don't blame officers who might not fit the ideal, you know, model of being a prison officer. We put, I mean, the unlocked graduates, you know, they are bringing in some fresh thinking into the prison system, but we employ our prison officers and we put them in the most difficult circumstance. I couldn't imagine a worse job, if I'm honest, than a prison officer in an overcrowded prison. It's just a hellish job.
Yeah.
It's hellish being a prisoner, and it's hellish being an officer.
So let me move us on, and you know, we've sort of reached the Q&A, and so I will use the fact that one of the questions in the Q&A addresses the issue that I wanted to address in the third part of our talk anyway, which is, you know, it seems as if everybody, you know, agrees that there are more effective ways to deal with offenders, that there are, you know, that as one Norwegian governor put it, you know, that the governor has the prison has to deal with somebody for, you know, a year or two or perhaps longer. Society has to deal with them for the rest of the time. And, you know, so there are so many things that we know would work better. And just to return to my opening comments and Alison's correction of them, you know, when I said prisons are expensive, I that's what I meant, that, you know, it just seems so obvious to people, and we've got sort of the evidence to show it, that there are better ways to deal with a great deal of both the things that are getting people into prison and with ensuring that people have better opportunities so that they don't reoffend when they get out of prison. And yet we seem incapable of achieving the political reform that's necessary. And that can't be because it's more expensive, because it isn't. It would in the long run be cheaper to have better public health, to have better welfare, to have better education. It would in the long run be cheaper to have better rehabilitation. So why is it that you can go back, you know, 20 or 30 years in this country and find prison ministers saying, well, it's all broken, we're going to fix it, and yet we don't? So what is holding back reform of the system? Alison, do you want to start with what do you think is holding back here, and then we'll move to Scott? And
I mean, I think an insight that I think is really helpful when we have this kind of conversation is was provided for us all by David Garland, who wrote this really good book on punishment and modern society. And he basically said that we're fooling ourselves if we think that prisons meet instrumental objectives, that if our objective is to reduce crime, all the mechanisms for reducing crime exist outside, in, you know, societies, in churches, in schools, and we kind of know this. So we're sort of pretending that the prison can meet these instrumental objectives, and we're ignoring its real purposes, which are at the moment to govern through, that they are symbolic and moral. So what the prison is good at is demarcations, defining moral boundaries, shifting moral boundaries, expressing public rage. And it's so good at those things that that's what keeps us fixated on the prison. And to pretend that the prison is a good political instrument or a good technique for reducing crime is a sort of self-perpetuating myth. So I think we have to kind of get over that. And it's frustrating that the prison has become so over politicized, and that what governments are doing is governing, you know, making these statements. They're talking to the electoral public. They're not actually talking about how to make a prison better, because this isn't how to do it. So I think that's one of the major things that's getting in the way, is that we kind of tell ourselves lies about what prisons can and can't do, and we expect things of it just can't deliver. If we were more realistic, then I think we'd end up having a much more sensible conversation about how we can't completely dismantle the prison. There are some people, as Irwin said, that we need to incapacitate, but the prison isn't for rehabilitation any more than it's for punishment. It's for some very limited things, and we should kind of organize our reform efforts from that place, I think.
thanks, Scott.
Yeah, to build off that, I think it's a combination of the politics of politics, fear, and media, combined with a lack of patience on the part of the general public. And so Alison earlier mentioned kind of the simplification of prison. It creates this kind of binary option. It's black and white. It also turns out it's really easy to communicate, good, bad. There's this really easy solution. And you think about how people process information, and actually it's the rational choices kind of traditionally are just more nuanced, and they take a little bit longer to explain. And as you're explaining them, even in places like New York, where we just passed bail reform, as you're trying to explain them, even if you win, one bad thing happens. And the pro-carceral forces, prosecutors, police, private prison companies, the bail bonds companies are very good at, you know, painting the reform or painting the alternative as the blood's running through the streets, using fear to double down on the status quo. It also turns out that it's really good for politics. It's like the classic line, you know, being soft on crime is political suicide. It turns out it's true. It's getting less true, and you're seeing in the United States right now more leaders willing to be a little bit more courageous when it comes to, you know, using their bully pulpit to talk about changes that need to be made. I don't think they're going far enough, but you know, this most recent election, we're seeing that even in places that voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, also voted for marijuana legalization. Back in 2006 or back in 2018. People voted for the Republican for governor, Ron DeSantis, but they also voted 67% for reenfranchisement for people who had criminal records. The problems that we're seeing then, once electeds have that courage to tell that more nuanced story and work through the narrative, to think through how to actually explain it in a way that's politically palatable and then therefore accessible by people, is that once the thing passes, how do you stand firm against the fear mongering that got us into the place, this place to begin with, so that they don't further entrench it? And that's really challenging. Frankly, advocates and activists are not used to winning. And so we're learning right now, as we're getting these wins around bail reform, around the low-hanging fruit, marijuana legalization, which has happened in Oregon, which is huge, decriminalization of all drug possession, not just marijuana, all drugs, heroin, coke, crack, etc. It's what happens then next that's really important. So the answer to your question is, it's the politics of fear media. It's fear, and it's the politicians who pass the laws and get political benefit out of it. And it's the lack of patience. I mean, if we want change, people need to be patient and allow these new solutions to run their course. And frankly, the way to do that, the way to make this happen, is a lot of the work that we're working on right now, my organization Zealous, which is narratives. There's a story that has been told by these pro-carceral forces for decades. And I'll just speak for myself, we've largely ceded the narrative floor. It's time for us to start entering it and talking about these things head on and fight against the fear.
Owen, I don't know. I mean, you must look on the system with some frustration that other people don't systematically get the chances you get. I mean, you've said over and over again, you know, I was lucky. What do you think stops? I mean, do you agree with, you know, what stops us making more people not lucky but reliably rehabilitated?
Well, it's what we want as a society. You know, unless you've been in prison, or you know somebody in prison, or you work in a prison, or you study prisons like Alison, or you're like Scott in that business, why should you care about prisons? You know, most people don't care about prisons until their mum's in prison, or their dad's in prison, or their brother's in prison, or their sisters, or they're in prison. You know, we've got a great letter in Inside Time this month, actually, from somebody who is complaining that he thought that prisons were holiday camps, and he's writing to the newspaper to tell us, my God, where's the holiday camp I was expecting? You know, I've always thought, I sort of, you know, I went into jail with that. I wasn't a sophisticated thinker when I went into prison. You know, I really wasn't an educated person. But I started to think about how I'd become what I'd become. You know, was I born bad? Was I made bad? Did I choose to be bad? And I sort of started to think about the people around me. You know, we think we know prisoners. We think we know these people in prison. We call them the murderers, the rapists, the pedophiles, the muggers, the drug dealers. You know, we think we know this gang of people, but actually, what we do, we think they're all mates together. They're all friends. These people in jail, all these prisoners. But actually what we do, we cram thousands and thousands and thousands of relatively dysfunctional people into these places we call prisons, and we call them the prisoners, and we think we know who they are. And I started to think, well, what is it? What is expected of me here? I could survive. I was robust enough to survive the sort of the vagaries of prison life. But I thought, I was trying to figure out, and I'd listened to politicians, and I figured out in the end, there seemed to be some sort of unwitting conspiracy between the politicians and the press to sort of create an image of prison that served both. They served the politicians were served by, prison works. You can't do the time, don't do the crime. Silly rhetoric like that, disingenuous political rhetoric. And then, of course, the press, they love a terrible prison story, a terrible criminal story. It enrages, it upsets people, it excites people, and of course we struggle as a society to pin down what it is we want from our prisons. And I'm only speaking to you guys tonight, and really pleased to be on this panel, because I learned about prisons by being in there for 20 years. I learned that our society, we deserve prisons that let people out less likely to cause more harm and distress. We deserve that. It costs around about between £3 and £4 billion a year to run our prison system. And the cost of reoffending, Mike, you mentioned earlier on 13 billion. It's actually 15 billion pounds a year, but that's by the Office for National Statistics. 15 billion pounds a year. That's the cost of reoffending. Now, if I was running a business where it was costing me 4 billion pounds a year to run, and I was losing 15 billion, I'd be in serious trouble. But that's what our government's been doing it for years. For some reason, we don't seem to have had a politician that can stand up and say, well, when we have, they disappear. They don't last very long. We have prisons. We're stuck with prisons for as long as, any foreseeable future. But there is possible to have a prison that lets people, that functions to let people out less likely to cause more harm and distress. I mean, it's so logical to me.
Mm. But in a sense, it's interesting because in a sense, I'll come to this that, my starting point, I suppose, was, we just go to the public and say, look, it'll be cheaper in the long run. But in a way, what all three of you have said, and picking up one of the questions, which talks about big political changes and Black Lives Matter and so on. I mean, in a sense, what all three of you have said is it's not quite so sort of instrumental or simple. To pick up Scott's word, we need to change the narrative. We need to win a story. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement, in a sense, is a story about what kind of place America is, and it's a story that has gained traction with people who aren't necessarily activists. And I get the sense that that's really what you think we need to do for prisons. We need to sort of change the story. In Alison's terms, we need to change what we think they're for, or what we tell ourselves about them. In Scott's terms, we need to change the story about what's going on. And in particular, then change the story about what they're for in terms of producing people who will reintegrate successfully into society. Sorry, Scott.
I was going to say, but I think Irwin really tapped into the key to narrative change, which is telling that more complicated story about who is actually being kind of pulled into the system and imprisoned. We hear the stories about these salacious crimes, these outliers, these horrible people. And so people tend to picture like the boogeyman, and all the boogeymen hang out together, right? Like you said. But I'll tell you, in my practice, I've represented thousands of people, and no matter how horrific the allegations are, and I want to press that it's a very small percentage of all the crime that's out there are actually very serious violent felonies. It's a small percentage, but in the words of Brian Stevenson, truly, when I meet folks, I'm always surprised by how much more they are than the worst thing that they've ever been accused of doing. And so thinking about ways to actually introduce the public, policymakers, through the press, through other forms of media, to the people who are actually going through this, and also having them explain kind of their experience is, I think, the most powerful form of storytelling. It's the most important form of storytelling, and it's also really powerful advocacy, kind of advocacy without advocating explicitly. And so, yeah, I think it's key to any kind of change we want. It's just going back to kind of centering the story and going back to Black Lives Matter really briefly. The thing that's so powerful, the reason why the Black Lives Matter movement has taken hold and why it's such an exciting moment is that there's just a ton of energy around it, and it's open and it's broadened kind of the base of people who are finally starting to understand that the system is unequal and is unfair and is cruel and is inhumane and et cetera. The benefit that it has is that it is latched onto the visible violence in the streets, more visible than ever right now. Because of the advent of iPhones and social media. The problem of what I saw and see inside jails, prisons, inside a court, is it's largely invisible. It's made invisible by the language of court, which is kind of full of legalese. Jails and prisons are made invisible by literal bars and walls. And so the key right now is how do we, as storytellers, as advocates, how do people who are directly impacted with direct experience on the inside introduce themselves and their experiences to the world? And that's kind of our challenge. But I think it's absolutely an essential one if we want any change.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to just start picking up questions. So one of the questions we've been asked by audience members, should short sentences be abolished? And do shorter sentences cause more and or different problems? I'm just going to build a bit on that, because to play devil's advocate for a second, I mean, we know that, at least for many categories of crime, that the people who suffer from crime are the same people, the same vulnerable, the same disadvantaged people. And, you know, I suppose to play devil's advocate, it's very easy to sit in, you know, comfortable university and say, let's abolish short sentences. But how do we, if that is the thought, how do we manage the transition from where we are now to a better kind of public health or welfare model without damaging the communities that we're also trying to help? Because, you know, if I lived in an area where, you know, I was constantly my car was being stolen, or my bicycle was being stolen, or, you know, my house was being damaged, or, you know, whatever it is, at some point one must just get impatient and think, I want this to stop. I don't want to keep suffering. And I do worry a bit about how we manage that transition. So perhaps we could take those in the sort of two steps. You know, do we think short sentences are just a mistake? I mean, should we just not be putting people in prison for less than a year, let's say? And if we do that, how do we manage the fact that there are antisocial people for various reasons who inflict real harm on, you know, at a low level, but real harm on the communities in which they live?
Mm-hmm.
Alison, I don't know whether...
I mean, I can certainly start. I don't think any of the experiments where there's been like early release programs because prisons have been very overcrowded, or, for example, states that have abolished the death penalty, you know, there've been lots of natural experiments in changing sentencing and becoming a bit more lenient, and none of them, as far as I know, have ever led to a spike in crime. So this feeling that, you know, if we suddenly abolish short sentences, there'd be this massive increase in burglary and robbery, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that that is the case. My knowledge of short sentences is they won't make the biggest dent. So I think that they won't solve the major mass imprisonment problem, but they are extremely disruptive. So they're often, short sentences cause people to lose their jobs, sometimes get thrown out of home, girlfriend breaks up with them, or whatever. You know, they cause mass disruption. And so they unpick the things that are going to keep people out. So I think if we had the same model of short sentence offenders as we do of, say, addiction, so think about people who are trying to give up smoking or drinking too much. Basically, the road to abstinence is littered with failure, and we accept it in our own lives that we try and be better, and then we fail, and then we try again. So why can't we have that kind of supported model in the community, and accept that failure is part of the success journey, and that there's always going to be stalling along the way, and that you could, some criminologists call these teachable moments. You know, we could learn a lot from the things that go wrong, instead of just assuming that somebody should just be catapulted back to prison at the first sort of wrong move. And that is also true of recalls to prison, that, you know, we trap people into these unimaginable requirements on probation, and then if they fail to get the bus that gets them to their probation officer on time, they end up back in prison. So I think we should think a bit more creatively about alternatives to short sentences, certainly.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you have to think about the things that are the conduct, and the people who commit conduct that are getting short sentences are not committing the crimes of the century, first of all. So it's a reflection of also, what do we criminalize? And the vast majority of short sentences in my practice, sometimes as short as a day or 3 days or a week, sometimes a year and a half, 3 years, are crimes of you know, they're drug offenses. It's petty larceny. It's in New York, it's jumping the subway turnstile without paying. It is some property damage, and there are things that, yes, like really cause damage. I think the best example that I ever had, or one of the best conversations about this topic that I ever had, was actually with a store owner who had this time it was Red Bulls and some cigarettes stolen by the same person as the person who I had represented for like the 5th or 6th time. And I was doing my investigation, and we actually struck up a conversation. Like, he was like, he needs to go to jail, you know, because if he doesn't go to jail, then this is just going to keep happening. And I was like, but he has been going to jail, and he's been getting out, and it's kept happening. And he hasn't gotten, instead of jail, the opportunity to actually live someplace that is quality and affordable. He wasn't given the opportunity to actually solve the substance use issue that he was actually stealing for. It turned out he wasn't stealing Red Bulls to drink them. He was stealing Red Bulls to resell. Same thing with all these cigarette packs for drug money. And it was this realization, was like, so, you know, I think that when we think about crime prevention, when I talk about crime prevention, I'm talking with, a prosecutor. We both want the same result. Look, I live in Brooklyn. I've got a family. I've got a young son. I don't want crime. I don't want people breaking into, I have a car. I don't want people breaking into my car. I don't want packages in my vestibule of my building stolen. And so it's not that I want crime to exist. I just have a different sense of what's going to get us to that place where less crime exists. And my sense is, if we're talking right now, solely right now, it's complicated. When we get into other stuff, I'm happy to talk about it. But these sorts of things should be decriminalized, and instead, major investment in communities, in the things that we talked about, in public health, in housing, and education, because it's not only an enormous waste of money, it just makes the problems that we're trying to solve worse. So,
Owen, I don't know. Your thoughts on short prison sentences? And
well, I always thought we either put people in prison for too short a time or too long a time in this country. I was, as a kid, as a teenager, I did a couple of short sentences. It didn't do anything to help me there wasn't enough time to resolve the issues that I had. You know, these short sentences, most reoffenders actually are people serving 12 months or under. And once I got into the maximum security prison system, and a lot of people like me doing long sentences, so many of us we'd had experience of short sentences and a gradual sort of increase in our criminalization, if you like, and the sense of the criminal identity. The more time you do in these short sentences, the more intense becomes your sense of being a criminal, having a criminal identity. You know, I mean, the irony and tragedy in my case was that it took me going to prison for life before I stopped thinking of myself as a criminal. You know, I was in court when I was 10 years old. And I remember the magistrate telling me I was going away for a long time, young man, you know, and he put me into care. But I was convicted of burglary as a kid, and I thought I was the worst person in the world. And I these short sentences as a teenager, the places I went to were like gladiator schools. They weren't places of nurturing, or they weren't places of I hate to use that word rehabilitation. It's such a strange word. It's a journalist word. It's a politician's word. I never, all the years I was in jail, I never heard a conversation between two prisoners discussing their rehabilitation. How's your rehabilitation going? This, oh, not too bad. How's yours, mate? Yeah, it's not something that it's a strange word, rehabilitation. But the places I was in as a kid, as a teenager, there were gladiator schools. There were violent places. There were some good people who worked in those places, but amongst the prisoner hierarchy, it was about who's the toughest, who's the hardest, who's the most criminal. When we get out, we're gonna be gangsters. We're gonna do this. We're gonna do that. And our whole criminal system, our criminal justice system, our prison system, there's a criminogenic culture in there, which really, that is the real, the reason our prisons fail is because we've allowed this criminogenic culture to thrive. And I don't know why we've allowed that to happen. Going back to Norway, when I was in the Norwegian prisons as a journalist, I didn't get a sense of a criminogenic culture. Our prisons, you got a language you got to learn. He's a screw, he's a con, slop out, bang up. Language doesn't really exist outside prisons. We've created these places that are totally alien to civilized, moral civilized society. We put people in there, and then we want them to come out as moral civilized individuals, but we damage them. We put them in prison, we damage them. And if we put them in there, they've got to survive prison. I don't think prison, you shouldn't have to go to survive it. It shouldn't be like that. Scott,
I think the answer why, I'm just going to say, like, this word that Alison used is feeling. The reason why we do this is just because, like, we like, our legislators like legislate based on feeling, general public like supports policies based on our gut, and not rational thought, right? Like, the thing I always come back to is that in the United States, if prison and jail and mass criminalization and policing actually prevented crime and made us safer, we'd be the healthiest, safest society in all history of all time. And you look at the United States right now, it's clear that that's not the case.
Okay, so
it's not the case because of feeling, because of fear, the way we process information. It's not based on data or rationalization or reason. We make these decisions because of feeling. I'm just going to go back to that word. It's a really important one, I think.
Okay, so we've got 15 minutes or so, and just to give you the heads up, I'm going to pick out 3 questions. I'll come. The last 2 will be what gives you hope, and the other one will be answer the question. Somebody's pointed out we should really answer the question that of the title of the webinar, which is what is the future for prison. So those will be the 2 things I come to. But I'm going to pick out a particular question because I think actually the answer will be of interest to everybody. So somebody has posted, I'll just read it out. I was interested in the unlocked grad scheme. That Scott, that's a scheme for getting graduates into prison officer and prison governance. But I was too worried about my own emotional resilience in such a role. What kind of person is best suited to working with prisoners in this role? So just very briefly, because we need to deal with all 3 questions. I mean, that strikes me as a really interesting question. What kind of person is best suited to working with prisoners?
Can I say something there?
Yeah,
because what I discovered in prison was that what gets universal respect is moral strength and moral courage, whether you're a prisoner or a prison governor or a prison officer. And people with moral confidence, that's the kind of people that make the best prison officers.
Yeah, that's excellent. I would like to echo that, but also I wanted to advertise one of my PhD students did her PhD on what makes a good prison officer, and she found very specifically, Helen Arnold, her name is, she found that this combination, I was interested, the question came from someone who's thought about unlocked graduates but isn't sure that he or she might be emotionally resilient enough. And Helen found that the best prison officers had this really complicated combination of being quite emotionally literate, so having the full range of emotions, but being really good at managing them. So it's not having total control over your emotions in the sense that you've stopped feeling and recognizing them. You are quite emotionally responsive, but you've got good techniques for managing and controlling those emotions. And that means you're still picking up, you're sensitive to the emotions of the people you're working with, but you're not overwhelmed by them. And that's a really important kind of balance, I think, of skills. So I'm trying to send a signal to the person who's worrying and saying, actually, coming in with feeling is not terrible, but you have to learn good techniques for managing those feelings, not extinguishing them.
Yeah, there's some parallels with public defense. Like all that stuff you said is true. And what I'll just add is you not only learn over time, you learn by doing. You know, it took, you know, close. I mean, I would still, you know, have that, you know, the secondary trauma. It's real, and acknowledging it is really important. But I had a really amazing support group with the core of other public defenders. We were able to laugh, cry, scream, and rage, but have that. But it's also learned skill over time. But I would say like the support of and the camaraderie of other people in the fight with you is really critical. And again, just acknowledging that it's tough. You know, the things that you see, no one is, if you don't have feelings, you're not going to be good at your job, and it's just unhealthy, frankly. So acknowledging it is the first step to actually being able to do it well and do it for a long time and not suffer from burnout.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So let me come to each of you, or just volunteer in what order you want to go in, and perhaps we could combine the two questions, because I think asking what is the future of prisons is probably going to get a pretty depressing answer, because at least as we've been discussing, you know, reform seems quite a long way away and the finances seem quite a long way away. Perhaps we can put the two together. I mean, what at the moment gives you hope for prisons and the criminal justice system generally, and what do you think the future of prisons might be? Let's put it that way. I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, I'll have a go. They're tough questions. They're very tough. And I think what gives me hope is the human conversations that go on inside prisons with both staff and prisoners, that I've never stopped feeling the way it can be quite, despite the terrible situation and conditions, it's kind of strangely, paradoxically life affirming to what happens to people in prison. I think is the way I would put it, I borrowed George Eliot, that you're sort of in the fundamental, that everything's stripped away and you really know what matters, and that so people talk about and realize what matters, and there's something quite hopeful about the way that gets that comes to the surface very quickly in a prison setting. So people don't stop being human, even when they're not regarded by the public as being human. And I think that there's something really important there. I wonder whether the phase we're in now, no, it's not quite like Black Lives Matter, but there's something pretty devastating about the realization that if you're physically stuck in the middle of a public health crisis, you're in a building sharing a cell without facilities, you're physically and emotionally at risk, that I think that it's pointing us in a direction away from overuse of the prison. So I'm hopeful that maybe this period we're going through now is forcing us to be more honest and realistic about what prisons are for, and use the information that we have. We've started to understand these institutions. I think we need to face the truth about them now, given what we're seeing.
Great, thank you. Scott?
The thing that makes me hopeful and optimistic is the energy among activists, advocates, practitioners. Public defenders are stepping outside of court and sharing their perspective and expertise about what's going on, and with press and in other forms like on social media more than ever before. And there's this interesting and really powerful collaborative advocacy that's developing between practitioner, so social worker, public defender, organizer, and directly impacted person, so either in or outside of jail and prison, and artists that are creating these really powerful narrative shifting opportunities that are making possible what I think the future of prison could look like. And I'll just focus on kind of, one area, which is violence, which is kind of the most challenging topic to talk about, or to kind of think through because of all the things, because of the feelings, as we talked about. On the front end, people becoming more open to what are called violence prevention programs. So before you're even talking about the police being involved, let alone prison, community organizations that are really built on trust, that prevent violence in the first place, that work with community, that dissolve conflict before it becomes conflict, and actually helps bring people together even when conflict actually happens, and speeding kind of far ahead once a crime does happen and violence does occur. The kind of increasing focus and trust and the data coming out of restorative justice approaches that Alison mentioned. I've seen it firsthand. Brooklyn is one of the places where the prosecutor's office in Brooklyn actually has within it the pioneering restorative justice program. We've seen the results. Just to give you a couple numbers, to give you a sense that this is not an impossibility, that there's something really to this. First of all, understand that over 50% of the people who are actually physically harmed or survivors of violent crime don't, in the communities that we serve, don't even call the police. A, because they don't trust them, and B, because they actually don't want incarceration. Among that, around 50% of people who do call the police, when they're, and after they've actually been harmed, when they're actually given a solution and explained what restorative justice means, and Alison explained it a bit, but it's a real serious process where both the harmed party and the person who harmed them go through a process that might take, in the program that we work with, 12 to 18 months, that ultimately brings the two parties together and both increases accountability and healing in a way that's never been done before, that wouldn't have happened in prison. When they're presented with that option, over 90% of people who are harmed choose the restorative justice approach. And then you take it a step further and you find out what are the results after someone goes through this process. Not only is there near 0% recidivism on the back end, and we're not talking about just like random, we're talking about attempted murder, shootings, beating people over the head with a hammer. These are cases where I've represented. Near 0% recidivism. And importantly, the person who is actually harmed talks about feeling actual healing and trauma reduced in a way that they never had before. And how do you, just really briefly, how do you measure the trauma or the lack of trauma or lack of healing that happens now with prison? The best example, and Danielle Surratt, who's extraordinary and really one of the pioneers of restorative justice, and she wrote this extraordinary book, Until We Reckon. She looked at thousands of letters that were sent by either loved ones of deceased loved ones or people who were harmed to parole boards decades after the fact. And the recurring theme in the vast majority of these letters were, it feels like it was just yesterday. And that was, I think, really powerful evidence that prison doesn't heal trauma. So I think the future is really thinking critically about the hardest topics, which are violence, and prison's not overwhelmingly not good for it, and there's alternatives for it.
Great, thank you. Owen, what gives you hope, and
Well,
what do you think the future might be?
Well, future, it looks a bit bleak, if I'm honest, the future of prisons. It's interesting hearing Scott and Alison talk about restorative justice, because people outside often think that people in prison don't care about the victims. They don't care about the pain they've caused. But I can tell you now that the walls in our prisons are dripping with shame and contrition and remorse and all that stuff. But often it's shielded by bravado and violence. Our prisons are pretty violent places sometimes. But my experience, I learned that people generally in prison, especially people doing some of the worst things, they want to do something good. They want to make some amends, but often it's too late. Someone like me, I can't make amends. My slate will never be clean. But there wasn't a great lot of opportunity in prison for me to do good. I did find, I did Braille transcription. I became a Samaritan in prison. I found ways of trying to put something into something back, if you like. But it's so difficult in prison but most people I met wanted to put something back, wanted to do something. And the restorative justice, I went to Ireland a few years ago for the BBC to witness restorative justice a conference. They call it a conference where the victim and the perpetrator, they have a conference. They sort of get together and they talk about what's happened to them. And it was one of the most powerful things I'd seen. You know, this young kid, he'd burgled an old couple's house. He'd shat on their carpet. He'd torn their photographs up. He was just a little scrote. He'd done a terrible thing to that old couple. And anyway, agreed to go on this Restorative Justice conference. And the old couple, I watched the old couple come in. They were terrified of meeting this criminal. And he little gingerhead fella, he came in all, you know, bolshy and full of himself. And I saw, when the old couple saw him, I saw them emboldened, because they had in their head some great monstrous criminal type. And it was just this little kid, you know, this little gingerhead kid. And he saw them, and I saw his bravado. I saw him shrink when he saw this couple. And they had a chat, you know, they talked about it. They were very humanized. It was very moving, actually, because, you know, at the end of it, this old couple were hugging this kid. And there was a humanizing thing about it. And I'm pretty sure, as Scott said, I don't know what happened to the kid afterwards, but I'm pretty sure that experience would have been so profound for him when he realized that these are his victims. He said to me afterwards, that could have been my grandparents. And they said to me, it could have been my grandson. You know, there's a humanizing thing to that. So I do, you know, I've seen restorative justice in action. It's not for everybody, I know, you know, but I think that could be something that we could look to the future and bring it into prisons. Bring that into prisons. Let people, you know, try and make some sort of some action towards healing for the victims and for the perpetrators. You know, I think humanization is the best way forward for our prisons. Humanization in place of dehumanization.
Well, that seems like a rather wonderful place to stop, and we are out of time. So, and let me just say to the audience, Owen's book is really an extraordinary. It's a difficult but extraordinary read. If you can go to the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge website, you can find out more information about Alison's pioneering work on what makes a good prison, on a moral prison. Scott, I must admit I hadn't met before. I follow him avidly on Twitter, and it is an account worth following. It's not always an easy account, and certainly prior to the election, it's been about the election recently, but prior to the election, a lot of it was about very human stories of people, particularly with COVID, in very difficult circumstances, and the utter frustration that comes through his account of trying to get a rational outcome for human beings. And so I recommend all three of those. So I'd like to thank Owen, Scott, and Alison tremendously for giving up their time to do this. And I'd like to thank the University of York, its AV team, without whom none of this would be possible. And Kezia, who's been looking at the Q&A and feeding them through to me, which has been very good. And finally, and really warmly, I'd like to thank all of the audience. I'm sorry I haven't got to anything like all your questions. There are something like 60 odd questions. There are more than 150 of you. And it's just been great, even though we can't see you, it's been great to know you're there and engaging with it. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And on that note, I will say good evening and stay safe.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Okay.
All right.
Good night,
Thank
guys.
you.